Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Brandell, who will discuss his book, Celluloid Culture's Cinematic Clients, Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy in the Movies. Welcome to Rip Rap.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
This is, as I told you before, is kind of a fun book. I mean, it has real intellectual substance, but I found it really enjoyable, and it also has quite an evocative discussion about psychoanalysis within the context of discussing various interesting films. So I'd like to find out how you started on this project and how it emerged.
Sure. Well, actually, the origin of the project dates to my having seen The Sixth Sense movie produced back in 1999. I went to see it shortly after it was in general release and was so taken with it that I ended up going to see it 3 times in a period of as many weeks, sort of dragging a different family member along each time. But I think that's probably the beginning of the idea of trying to put something together like this, a kind of transdisciplinary anthology of this sort. And I think what was so striking to me about The Sixth Sense was that it explored sort of the interiority of the process of therapy in a way that most films have not been able to do, certainly with as much success. And it also talked about or represented aspects of the therapeutic process that usually are not as not as accurately represented. I mean, in an important sense, this film, because it has to do with a kid who has paranormal abilities, is a very unusual genre, to sort of serve as a backdrop for a psychotherapeutic relationship between a doctor and a child patient. On the one hand. On the other hand, maybe there was a certain license to exploring aspects of the encounter that you don't have in other genres. But I was very taken with the way in which the doctor's dilemma, his sort of experience of trauma was incorporated into the film and used as kind of a vehicle for looking at the relationship and how it deepens over time and the different meanings that it has. So I was very impressed by it at the time. It also seemed to do quite a bit with the therapeutic relationship in a way that most films don't have the patience to do. I mean, you see little sort of excerpts, from a therapy, but sometimes reduced, to the point of absurdity, and then there are often elements that make us question, how reliable this representation really is. Oftentimes the therapy is kind of portrayed misleadingly, and it's kind of a pathological relationship, or there are a whole lot of cliches when it comes to depicting psychotherapy, generally speaking, in film, that I thought this film was largely absent when I saw The Sixth Sense. And I thought, there are, I guess another aspect that I found very interesting was that it explored, in a way that wasn't sensationalistic, the therapist's own problems. That is to say, the countertransferences that he enacted in the treatment, his own struggle, and sort of in the aftermath of the trauma that he's experienced. And I think it was that sort of vector between the patient, Haley Joel Osment's transference, and the doctor, Malcolm Kroeber, as well as his countertransference, that made it really a fascinating vehicle. And I remember finding it one of the first films that I had seen, recent films that I had seen, where there was some effort to capture, I think, the richness of the process of therapy with kids. Then I think at about that time, my father had died just a few weeks before the film came out, and I think there was something about the whole paranormal business and, you know, the communion between the living and the dead that must have been a factor as well in sort of in shaping my interest in the film.
Well, that I found very interesting is that you saw something in popular culture and then started reflecting on it in a scholarly way and bringing these different aspects to it. You know, the type of therapy that was involved and the dynamics between doctor and patient. I just found that, you know, that you really took something that you could have just walked by and that you started really reflecting on it. I thought that was quite nice. And actually, the book kind of examines that throughout, is things that may be happening on these celluloid couches, but then reflecting on it, what does that, how does that work in terms of the discipline?
Well, you know, let me give you what may be somewhat less than direct answer, but one of the objectives, I guess, in putting this volume together was to try and understand the way in which culture shapes, you know, the portrayal of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, but also whether or not there is some essence that's being shown on the silver screen there that really is not so much a distortion, but a more or less accurate sort of picture, an accurate depiction of something that's really happening. And one of the most, I guess one of the best examples I could give you, and it's not, it's in the book in part. There's a chapter written by Sanford Gifford, who's a psychoanalyst from Boston and a psychoanalytic historian who's very interested in film, examining a silent film made in 1926 called Secrets of the Soul. Was produced by G.W. Pabst, who was, I guess depending upon which version of film history you subscribe to, was either an exponent of Die Neue Sachlichkeit or a German expressionist, and maybe both, depending upon, according to certain accounts. But Pabst's film was really the first serious attempt to capture the psychoanalytic process on film. It was produced as a commercial film, and it was a fairly successful one at the time, in the mid-20s. What's interesting is that in that version of psychoanalysis, there is you have the sense that psychoanalysis is seen as a means of psychological salvation, and there are sort of fundamental truths that, once uncovered, can lead to the cure of this patient's neurosis. And it's framed very classically. As a matter of fact, on this particular film, two of Freud's close adherents, disciples, were involved in the production and wrote portions of the screenplay. Freud himself disapproved of the whole process. He was very skeptical about the plastic arts being able to add anything to our understanding or portrayal of psychoanalysis. But I think what you see is that you know, very sort of classical framework, and a view that simply by achieving understanding and insight, you know, and understanding those factors in the patient's history that culminated in the production of neurotic symptoms, that you can cure this neurosis. And so that was sort of the prevailing view at that time. And then if you sort of fast forward to Hitchcock's Spellbound, which was produced in the mid-40s, a somewhat different picture of psychoanalysis emerges. And in Spellbound, you have a post-traumatic patient, Gregory Peck, who essentially assumes the identity, falsely assumes the identity of a deceased person whose murder he's witnessed. And without going into a lot of detail, you know, once again, there is the strong intimation that through understanding the history and sort of putting things, reconstructing the events that led up to the trauma, and there's this sort of a remote historical element. There's a childhood trauma that has to come to light in order for Gregory Peck to be, cured. But there's also there's another element in this film that's not present in earlier films. It's the sense that the environment actually can play more of a role. And it's not just about intrapsychic phenomena like Secrets of the Soul. Now the forces that sort of shape behavior that come from outside the person have a much more prominent role. And I think probably that was a function. I mean, the film was made in '45, so it probably was a function in part of the experience with traumatic neuroses in war and what is referred to as eco-psychology, which is sort of a variant of it's a different way of understanding development, and it's really a different framework than classical psychoanalysis. That was becoming more popular at the time. So there are subtle and maybe not so subtle changes in those two depictions. Then if you move into there's a wonderful film that was also the topic of another of the chapters, David and Lisa. The two versions of David and Lisa. There's one that was produced in 1962, and then there's the 1998 version, I think, the Oprah Winfrey version. Well, the 62 version is, I think, far more successful. But in this version, you got an adolescent in treatment with a very compassionate, understanding, profoundly sensitive psychotherapist. And in the story, what you see is that there are mutual contributions of the therapist and client to the therapeutic process, that there's a way in which the therapist's role is humanized and acquires importance, and it's the relationship rather than these historical events, as in Spellbound and Secrets of the Soul. The relationship becomes the crucible for analytic cure. There's a lot more focus on the relationship and the sort of transference dimensions and the kind of reciprocal, mutual influence of client and therapist. And then, this is a kind of wild example, but I don't know if you're familiar with the film 12 Monkeys.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. 12 Monkeys, and I think another thing that's happening all along is that society's faith in psychoanalysis is gradually waning. In 1926 there was tremendous excitement. This ferment of in the world of psychology and psychotherapy. And psychoanalysis was the answer, and the couch accordingly became the modal method of treatment, analytic treatment. But I think certainly by the late 50s, early 60s, there's maybe a little bit less confidence. There are competing ways of understanding the process of therapy, of understanding neurosis and psychopathology more generally, and certainly by the 90s, with the influence of postmodernism, with the kind of perspectival and relativistic view that had become sort of accepted. There's no absolute truth. There are truths with small t's, and uncovering the kind of historical basis of neurosis is no longer regarded as by a lot of folks as the major goal of therapy. It's the relationship itself that has become the focus. In 12 Monkeys, what's really interesting, I think in particular in terms of Dr. Raley's interpretation of Cole's dream, it's also a Bruce Willis character, that she's wrong. She's wrong in her interpretation, and I think, and she's also involved with her patient in a way that is, from a clinical perspective, is highly problematic. She falls in love with him, and she's, becomes his advocate and sort of friend and so on. So there's a kind of diluting of the treatment relationship, and not clear at times, who's patient and who's therapist. And I think it's, the fact that she can make an interpretation that is so wrong really shows us that there is a great deal less confidence in in psychoanalysis to be able to furnish us with meaningful answers to issues. So there's been a real shift, a kind of transformative shift from the 20s, to the present. And I think there are many other examples, of course, but those 4 films, which I'm very interested in, with respect to, sort of these different ways of understanding the process of therapy, and also the kind of influence of popular culture on the portrayal of therapy. Those are probably some of the best examples.
Well, interest to me is it seemed to be that underneath all this, the relationship with patient and therapist is similar to people looking at a movie in a way, because they're looking at a narrative, mm-hmm. and they're trying to come up with an interpretation of what is happening in that. And they could be flat wrong, or they could be close, or they could be right on. But there is this, I like the way that this book functions as a thoughtful analysis or reflection, or taking a look at what's going on. And there's, as I told you just before the interview, there's layers in this book. While it's intended for a more general audience, technically someone dealing with it, although I think it'd be valuable for all of that. There is this interesting synergy that goes back and forth between the profession itself and what it's doing, the people who are involved with the profession, and the people who are representing it, but they're all kind of looking at this narrative and what's happening and trying to understand it. And so in that way, I thought it was quite interesting, because some of the films, like I Never Promised You a Rose Garden, are based, in fact, on mm-hmm. actual relationships. Mm-hmm. And like you were saying, there's this, what is happening here? Is this an effective strategy for dealing with something, or is it problematic? And one of the words that cropped up was the word error. That from time to time you say, no, that's not going to work, or that something was working largely, but then there was something else that you were concerned, or the people who were writing about it were concerned about it.
Yeah, I think that there has been a tendency to dismiss many films that attempt to portray psychoanalysis or psychotherapy. And actually, there's a very well-known psychoanalyst author who's written a book on psychiatry and the cinema. And the book, for the most part, offers, I think, well-reasoned critiques of many of the films that have, endeavored to sort of represent some aspect of therapy. In some cases, it's actually co-authored, that these 2 authors are pretty dismissive of many of these films because they're so pathological, misleading, distorted, filled with cliches and so on, and are not accurate portrayals, and are sensationalistic, as I was saying before. But my sense was, and I read that book and I've used it in teaching too, but I find that perspective is a bit limiting. And it occurred to me that there may be things about the process of therapy that films can actually teach us. And the example of The Sixth Sense, but for that matter, Ordinary People, I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. There's certainly other examples, and those are the 3 that I focused on in one of the chapters that I contributed. There's a sense that we may be able to portray some aspects of this mysterious process of therapy with with more dimension and in a more kind of enriched way in commercial film than you can get from reading articles about, where they're case examples, but the case examples are kind of lifeless and two-dimensional. Frankly, I've read too many articles written by therapists, and I probably should include myself, where the heart of the process somehow doesn't find its way onto the page, onto the written page. And I think in commercial film, despite the many problems that are often true, that the Gabbards have pointed out in their book and others have called our attention to, there's something that is unique. I think there is a way of being able to represent a process that you can't do in an article, even a pretty well-written article. And nowadays, people seem to be, are often more interested in portraying therapeutic successes, but of course in commercial film, it's just as often true that we are portraying therapeutic failures, sometimes dramatic failures, on the part of therapists, in the relationship, the final sort of outcome of treatment. And that I also find very interesting. The fact notwithstanding, as I've already mentioned, that in some cases there is considerable distortion, so we have to be kind of mindful of that. But at the same time, there is a kind of richness and sort of feeling of participation in the process that you can represent in film in a unique way.
You make the point in your book that your book is not an attempt to have a compendium of all the movies, the 500 movies that have dealt in some way with psychoanalysis, that you were selective as far as the ones that might be interested in exploring some point that had relevance, and I think that's quite helpful too. Well, and you talked about Freud in that other movie, The Secrets of the Soul, and his idea of plastic representation. And I wondered, had you thought about why he was so dismissive? I mean, he really seemed almost offended that his two disciples, or whatever, were interested in doing this project. I'm really, it's somewhat of a loss. I think that in important respects, he failed to sort of take advantage of a wonderful opportunity. I think it can be done responsibly. And actually, Secrets of the Soul, it's not a terribly inspiring film. It's not filled with great drama, but at the same time, it's a fairly faithful representation of Freud's classical, psychoanalytic therapy. So I think he may have erred in, not seizing on this opportunity, but he seemed very distrustful of any effort, and I think part of his reasoning must have been that there's an absence of dimensionality that will not be possible to, there are missing parts when you try and show something on film that you can't fill in, that invariably will lead to a distortion of what he saw as the essence of psychoanalysis. But I think he probably made a mistake. Well, but it was early on in terms of film, at that time, and there were a wild range of what was going on at that time in terms of film. And of course, we couldn't talk about psychoanalysis in cinema without mentioning people like Woody Allen, who's got this whole body of work. And it was kind of fun because it really showed that point again, that taking an informed position and taking a look at what Woody Allen does, it doesn't change it, but it opens it up more than what I had realized anyway, of how he was doing it and what was going on in that. And so I found that, taking another look at Annie Hall and so forth was really helpful.
I guess when you've been in analysis for 25 years or so, you can say anything that you want to about it, or make it a focus of virtually every film that you direct, which is certainly the case with Woody Allen.
A person in it and doing it, yes. And we should mention the interview that you had with Dr. Rubin, who was involved with the David and Lisa project.
Well, I was very interested to talk with somebody who had written a story that was subsequently made into a film in which psychotherapy or psychoanalysis played a prominent role. And talking with Dr. Rubin was really a delight for a number of reasons. We had a very wide-ranging discussion, not all of which is included in that last chapter, but a good portion of it is. But he talked about some of the problems inherent in sort of making the shift, from the screenplay to the film, the need on the part of the director and producer to interpolate other elements, for dramatic effect that really weren't part of the story, and from his point of view weren't necessary at all, but from their point of view, sort of looking at it as a commercial product, were essential. So he talked about that, and his, and interestingly, his preference. That he really preferred the earlier version to the later one. You'd think that in a more recent version with improved technology and all kinds of capabilities they wouldn't have had 35 years or 36 years beforehand, that there was the potential for a very different and a more polished product and so on. But he really liked the kind of the rawer, the more primitive feel, I guess, to the '62 product. He liked the black and white versus the color. Howard Da Silva played the part of the therapist in the earlier version. It was Sidney Poitier in the later version. Really, Howard Da Silva's performance was an outstanding one, and a lot of therapists, certainly from an earlier generation, view that portrayal as coming much closer to what really happens in therapy. The therapist doesn't have all the answers. He keeps trying. There's resistance on the part of the patient. The patient is outright hostile at times, and he's trying to sort of make sense of this, and he's struggling with it. And that part of the performance was compelling and realistic. So I think that when you try and think of those films where the portrayal was really was a lot closer to reality, or was, I should say, was close to reality. I think that's the one that comes up most often.
The book is, I think, really interesting and evocative, and as I told you before, and I'll say it again, it's nice because it is accessible and there are these nuggets of insight into this process, and I found it quite interesting.
Well, I'm pleased, and we've certainly accomplished something important if that's true.
Well, thank you for being on Rip Rap.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you.